It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice, right here, right now. You're joining us midway through our show. We're glad to have you on board. Today is Thursday, the 10th of April. We will be discussing in this particular segment the DHS and the report which they have kept silent from Americans relating to North Korea and the threat of an EMP attack that they have very clearly made. We'll get into how dangerous the risk really is to our nation of an EMP attack coming from a nation like North Korea. It's not just North Korea, but the particular study was suppressed because it was a report that was prepared by the Department of Homeland Security for the Defense Department. And in that report, they concluded that North Korea could deliver on its threat, that it had the capability and the wherewithal to accomplish that, and that by the use of an electromagnetic pulse attack, they may well be able to destroy the entire United States or vast segments. And there are a couple of examples that they used in the report. Now, WorldNet Daily is the one who put this out there, and WND.com. And the links to the article will be in the body of this, in the subject area for this video, if you're catching this on YouTube. Or it's on our website and our Facebook page and on Patriot FB and a host of other places that we post stuff up. The problem that we have here is that, for those of you that aren't aware, we have no solution to an EMP attack. Even the CIA chief has made that statement very clearly. We have looked at the possibility of an EMP attack in the United States of America from a number of threats, not the least of which is China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and a host of other smaller but perhaps less capable incidents. Here's the point. What you don't know about EMP, and you need to know, is that it is not the type of nuclear weapon when you think of Hiroshima, Nagasaki type weapon. Detonation occurs at about 20 or 30 miles above the atmosphere, or above the surface, I should say. And all it creates, there's no fallout. And the damage, of course, it's done at such a high altitude that there's no physical damage to property. But what it does do is it creates it electrifies the atmosphere over the area in which it bursts, and it creates an electromagnetic pulse that for a brief nanosecond fries all the electronics. Now, this is the same thing that you've heard about from the Carrington event, which happened in the 1800s, where it was caused by a massive solar explosion that hit the Earth with heavy rays, gamma rays, and effectively it was so powerful that it melted copper telegraph lines. Now, we didn't have the electronic world in the late 1800s that we have today, and so the only way that anyone actually ever knew that the Carrington attack or Carrington event occurred was the fact that these telegraph lines were so heavily affected. Telegraph operators were shocked. Literally physically shocked. It was so severe that even with the batteries disconnected, telegraph operators were able to send messages because the lines were humming with power. It melted copper lines. Now, scientifically, the suspicion is that there's been many of these Carrington-type events in past history, but no one can really prove it or disprove it because there's no electronics around to verify that they were fried. However, our world is totally different today. And with the advent and the dependence that we have on electronics, whether that be information systems or our grid itself, and the ability to operate and run that grid, whether it be automobiles or transportation, whether it be manufacturing or the ability to produce power or produce actual fuel. Remember now, when you talk about an EMP, the issue of an EMP would be catastrophic in the United States. I mean, think about this for a moment. Let's say that you were going to throw an EMP in two different countries. One would be the United States of America, and another would be, let's say, Afghanistan. Think about the difference. Well, Afghanistan, in large part, is already a nation. I mean, perhaps over the last 20 years or so, they've gained a lot of electronic capability, but only exclusively as a result of the United States and Russia's involvement over there as in war. But these are, for all intents and purposes, it's a third world country. They would not be as impacted by an EMP event, whether natural or man-made, as would the United States of America. For us, it would be catastrophic, devastating. It would completely wipe out industry. It would wipe out hospitals, any transportation, any power. It would destroy the items that actually operate and run on electricity and permanently destroy them. They would not be salvageable because it would burn the boards, the circuit boards. It would fry them. It would burn out the generators and the transmitters and the parts and portions of our grid that are, for all intents and purposes, irreplaceable for years. In other words, the transformers that support our electrical grid system in the United States of America, in some cases would take, and these are estimates that Congress has come up with in some hearings that they've had, but they would take 3 years or more to reproduce. And worse yet, we no longer manufacture them in the United States. They're now manufactured overseas. So, first and foremost, you'd have to replace them. Assuming, for argument's sake, that this was not a natural event, and therefore maybe global in its scale, you could, let's say, have a new transmitter or a new power system built in another country, France or, let's say, Germany. But then you got to transport it from there to the United States. Then you got to get it from the coast, with no power, mind you, all the way to, let's say, Ohio or Nevada. Whole different circumstance now, huh? The problem is that we have no methodology to, one, protect ourselves from this, and or to diffuse one were it to come. Worse than that, the DHS created this report and then has suppressed it from public knowledge. There was a copy that was obtained by Peter Pry from sources within the DHS. And the report states that North Korea could use the Yunha-3 space launch vehicle and deliver a nuclear warhead as a satellite over the South Pole to attack the U.S. from the south. Now, Pry is the executive director of the Congressional Advisory Task Force on National and Homeland Security, and he pointed out that the U.S. has, quote, no early warning radar or interceptors to stop such a missile from the south. He's also the director of the congressionally mandated EMP Commission, which has been looking at this issue of EMP for some time. Of course, their hands are tied, and here's why. And, of course, the ridiculousness of this entire thing will be borne out to you in just a moment. The reason that we will not put together a plan of to essentially bleed off or put circuit breakers, if you will, into our grid system is that the utility companies have long lobbied Congress not to pass that type of legislation that would mandate that they institute a stopgap measure, a circuit breaker, if you will, in the grid that would be able to protect individual aspects or portions. Now, EMP, for all intents and purposes, it would still destroy automobiles' electronic ignition systems, and it would still destroy airplanes that were in the air and airplanes on the ground. but at least the grid would be intact, so we would be able to replace the items, the widget, the iPad, the car, the whatever. But you would never be able to replace the actual grid itself. And the pressure has been on from lobbyists who have spent tens of millions of dollars to keep from having to spend a few billion, which, quite frankly, they're going to pass on to you anyway. And frankly, I would just as soon see the federal government put that money up and make sure that it was done and done properly, and then, as opposed to, some of the most asinine and ridiculous things we do spend money on. Pry is the staff director for the congressionally mandated EMP Commission. And they have concluded that the damage from either a natural or a man-made EMP event on the nation's unprotected electrical grid would have a cascading effect that would impact life-sustaining critical infrastructure, as well as electronic components and all automated control systems. So let's understand what life-sustaining critical infrastructure is. That's the hospital that's got the guy alive on dialysis, or a heart monitor, or a breathing apparatus. Life-sustaining critical infrastructure would be the ambulances that could not run anymore to get to people that were now, injured in a fire because there's no fire trucks to get out to put out the fire. It would also affect the electronic components and automated control systems. And there we're talking about water. There we're talking about the natural gas lines that are in the ground. I mean, there is electronic automated control that determines how much gas is in the pipe. What's the pressure? When those go, does the pipe just back up? Does it dry up? Does it explode because the pressure becomes too high? Along with the critical infrastructure of the electronic grid system, we have to also include telecommunications. Everything that we do in terms of communications is based on electronics. Everything. All the routing, all the tables that determine how a phone call gets routed, whether it's from your NSA personal tracking device, or whether it's, your home telephone, or whether it's a walkie-talkie, all of that involves critical electronic components. Banking. The United States and the dollar would evaporate like that. Literally. Finance, petroleum, and natural gas pipelines, and the ability to refine and create more. Transportation, food and water delivery, emergency services, and even space systems. Don't forget, you'd have satellites dropping out of the sky like bowling pins. DHS conducted this study after the spring of 2013, where the nuclear crisis with North Korea was brought forth, and the communist government's leadership threatened a, quote, preemptive nuclear strike on the United States. And if you recall, I talked about this back in spring of 2013 when I talked about the fact that North Korea had put out on television and sent out on videos these videos where they were depicting North Korea launching a preemptive nuclear strike on U.S. cities, in Washington, D.C. and New York, as I recall, were the two. Now, DHS began taking a look at this and saying, well, maybe these guys are more serious. And it turns out, not only are they serious, but they have the method and the means, and obviously the motive, to accomplish that. They actually practiced an EMP attack scenario, North Korea did, 3 months before that crisis occurred. Now, that crisis was, if you recall, they were detonating nuclear weapons at the time underground and doing testing and so forth and so on. During that crisis, according to Mr. Pry, North Korea issued a general mobilization order to its nuclear forces, and that included their, what they call, space forces. According to Mr. Pry, they're just testing the water to see what they can get away with. And, quote, it shows that Pyongyang is planning something big against the U.S. Now, he didn't say this might indicate, this may be some sort of an indicator or a test. What he said is, quote, the North Koreans are seeing what they can get away with. it shows that Pyongyang is planning something big against the U.S. He didn't say they may be planning. He didn't say it's a possibility. He said it shows that Pyongyang is planning something big against the U.S. In this suppressed study, the DHS indicated that if North Korea were to attempt to deploy their space launch vehicle, or there's another one they have called the Taepodong-2 Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, it's an ICBM, the Defense Department could destroy the missile on its launch pad before it actually launched. The problem with that is this. One, they're not limited to being launched from North Korea. In fact, there were some that were pulled from Cuba not so long ago that were capable of going up and being sent up 150 miles above the Earth, which would be the height that you would do a high-altitude EMP. Furthermore, they could actually just be launched from a cargo ship out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, for example, or maybe off the eastern coast, or maybe 100 miles out off the west coast. At the time, Obama and the White House, quote, repeatedly asserted that North Korea did not yet have the capacity to attack the United States or U.S. allies with nuclear missiles. But he conveniently, like everything else this piece of trash does, he conveniently left off the fact that they could utilize an EMP, which quite frankly would be far more devastating to the United States of America than a separate nuclear detonation in a major city. Oh, it wouldn't be worse for the 5 million residents of that city, but it would affect 315 million Americans when all of us no longer had power for the remainder of our natural lives. The death rate in the United States, ladies and gentlemen, would be 2/3 of the population within the first 24 months. Be 1/3 of the population within the first 2 months. Why was this kept a secret? Why? Well, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but think about it for a moment. There's been a couple of books written about the idea of it, that it could be utilized as cover under the auspices of a global economic collapse, a fiscal collapse of the dollar, which would start a slide globally, and then back that up with an EMP, which would basically, for all intents and purposes, throw everybody into the dark for so long nobody would ever be able to figure out what was really going on. The problem here is that we are woefully unprepared. And for all of the trillions of dollars that we're spending on national security, the estimates to make our grid EMP, not proofed, but EMP defensible, whether natural or man-made, is in the billions of dollars. We're talking $2 to $5 billion is the number that I've heard. And I've seen it repeatedly, by the way. So it's not one that, I just picked a low number. $2 to $5 billion. With all due respect, ladies and gentlemen, $2 to $5 billion is the rounding error on the Senate's travel bill for a year. I mean, it's unbelievable to me. The Department of State, it came out the other day, and Hillary Clinton cannot account for $6 billion worth of contracts. And that was only during her tenure. You're telling me that you cannot come up with $2 to $5 billion to make it a priority to protect our national grid. I'm not saying that your Chevy Cobalt is ever going to run again in the event of a natural or a man-made EMP. It probably won't. But I can tell you this. The loss of electrical power in the United States of America would have a devastating effect on every aspect of life throughout the nation. In December of 2012, North Korea launched a satellite. This makes it even uglier. this was information provided to WorldNet Daily by Pry and former ambassador U.S. Ambassador Henry Cooper, and they indicated to the author of this article that the satellite had been launched, and it was large enough to have been a nuclear weapon capable of orbiting the Earth and detonating on command over the United States or anywhere else that they so chose. In the interview with WorldNet Daily, Pry said Pyongyang in April of 2013, a year ago, folks, launched a satellite that was tracking orbit over the United States. First in the middle of the country, so it ran right over the top of the middle of the country, which is the perfect place to cover basically the entire country. And then the second time over the eastern half of the United States, where it ran right up the eastern seaboard. That's the most populated corridor in the United States. In fact, the estimates are that an EMP in that area would wipe out 70% or cover 70% of the population centers in the United States. Pry said very clearly that if the satellite were a nuclear weapon, exploded above the middle of the U.S., the EMP effect on the vulnerable grid system would have been nationwide. In the numerous underground nuclear tests, North Korea has been testing low-kiloton nuclear weapons that Pry says were a super EMP. Quote, super EMP, that is a device that's designed to emit a large amount of gamma rays, which is the electromagnetic energy that's associated with an EMP blast. Again, there's no fallout from radiation here. This thing gets blown up at 150, 200 miles above the surface of the Earth. In this interview with WorldNet Daily, Pry said that the revelations in the suppressed DHS report are only the latest indications of North Korean intentions aimed at a possible nuclear EMP attack on the United States. The prospect is the latest in a series of recent North Korean actions. He's talked also about the revelation of a Soviet-era nuclear-capable ground-to-air missile that was discovered on a North Korean ship just in July of 2013 as it ran through the Panama Canal. That was 90 miles from the United States of America. And with a missile that was launched from a freighter, it would be virtually impossible to ever identify who was responsible. Pry says the EMP attack on the U.S. would not have to originate from North Korea, but could be a missile such as the SA-2 launched from any freighter off the U.S. or the East or the Gulf Coast. And there would be no missile defense capable of halting such an event. Ladies and gentlemen, I just give you the information. Do with it as you will. But this is another example of a crime against humanity, that the DHS would have this information and withhold it from America. I cannot believe this is our country, folks. I can't believe this is where we've descended. We'll be back in just a minute. When we come back, we're going to talk about Darrell Issa, the IRS investigation, and Elijah Cummings, who sits on the group on the committee panel, but has now been accused of actually colluding with the IRS to target certain conservative news or conservative organizations. I mean, give me a break, folks. This is just insane. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to America's Voice Now.